You've probably wondered at least once what it would sound like if God spoke to you right now. Maybe in a quiet room, maybe in a moment of crisis. You imagine something huge, a voice that shakes the walls. But the real answer, the one written into the oldest religious texts on earth, is far stranger than that. Ancient humans didn't wonder what God's voice sounded like the way you do. They believed they already knew. Go back to the very beginning of the biblical story, to the garden. Genesis doesn't describe God appearing in a flash of light or a booming proclamation from the sky. It describes a sound. The text says Adam and Eve heard the sound of the Lord walking in the garden in the cool of the day. Not a lecture, not a decree. Footsteps. A presence moving through space, close enough to hear, close enough to hide from. That detail matters more than it seems. In the ancient world, hearing was not a background sense the way it often is for you. The scholar Walter Ong spent years studying what he called oral cultures, societies before mass literacy, and one thing he kept finding was this. For people who lived by sound instead of text, a voice was never just information. A voice was a person, arriving. When you heard someone speak, you weren't receiving a message. You were standing in their presence. So when ancient Israelites imagined God speaking, they weren't imagining a sound effect. They were imagining an arrival. Now push forward centuries later to a mountain in the desert. Exodus chapter 19. The Israelites are camped at the base of Sinai, and the text says there was thunder and lightning, a thick cloud on the mountain, and a very loud trumpet blast. The ground itself trembled, and when God finally speaks the 10 Commandments, the people are so overwhelmed that they beg Moses to make it stop. They tell him, "You speak to us and we will listen, but don't let God speak to us directly or we will die." Think about that for a second. This wasn't awe in the pleasant sense. This was terror. The ancient mind didn't experience divine sound as comforting. It experienced it as dangerous, almost unbearable, the way you might feel standing too close to a jet engine, except the sound wasn't mechanical. It was personal. It was aimed at them. And this wasn't unique to Israel. The scholar Mark Smith, who spent decades researching the wider religious world surrounding ancient Israel, points out something important. Across the ancient Near East, thunder was widely understood as the voice of a storm god. The Canaanite god Baal was described almost exactly this way, a deity whose voice rolled across the sky in the form of a storm. So when the psalmist writes in Psalm 29 that the voice of the Lord is powerful, that the voice of the Lord breaks the cedars, that the voice of the Lord strikes with flashes of lightning, he isn't inventing a new metaphor out of nowhere. He's using a sound the entire ancient world already associated with divine power and redirecting it. Not Baal in the storm, Yahweh in the storm. The vocabulary was shared, the claim underneath it was not. This is where it gets stranger, because if you stopped here, you'd think the whole story is ancient people believed God's voice was the loudest, most overwhelming sound imaginable. But then you get to the prophet Elijah in the first book of Kings, hiding in a cave on that same mountain, Horeb, running from a death threat, exhausted, afraid, maybe closer to giving up than at any point in his life. And God tells him to go stand at the entrance of the cave, because the Lord is about to pass by. First comes a wind, so strong it tears the mountains apart and shatters rocks. The text tells you directly, the Lord was not in the wind. Then an earthquake. The Lord was not in the earthquake. Then fire. The Lord was not in the fire. And then after all of it, after the display you would expect God's voice to arrive inside, there is something the original Hebrew describes almost impossibly. Some translations render it a still small voice. Others render it more literally as a sound of thin silence, a voice made of quiet. That's the moment Elijah covers his face. Not during the wind, not during the fire, during the silence. Why does that detail exist at all? Why would a culture that associated divine voice with thunder and quaking mountains suddenly tell a story where God shows up in almost nothing? Because somewhere inside this tradition, a deeper claim is being made. Power was never really the point. The wind and the fire and the earthquake were the kind of things ancient people expected a god to sound like. the kind of overwhelming force the whole ancient world already agreed a deity should command. But the God of this story deliberately walks past all of that and chooses instead to arrive in the one place a person like Elijah, broken and hiding, might actually be able to hear him. Not a display for a crowd on a mountain, a whisper for one exhausted man in a cave. You see this pattern again later in the prophet Ezekiel's vision, where he describes a divine sound like the roar of rushing waters, like the voice of the Almighty, unmistakably vast. And you see it again in Job, when God finally answers Job's suffering, not gently but out of a whirlwind, a voice too large to argue with. The ancient imagination clearly still reached for grandeur when it needed to describe overwhelming holiness. The scholar John Walton, who has spent much of his career reconstructing how ancient Near Eastern people understood their gods and their world, argues that this dual picture, the thunder and the whisper, wasn't a contradiction to the ancient mind. It was the whole point. A god big enough to command a whirlwind and intimate enough to speak in near silence wasn't two different gods. It was one god refusing to be reduced to either. So what did ancient humans actually think God sounded like? Not one thing. They thought he sounded like whatever the moment required. Thunder, when a nation needed to understand it was standing before something it could not control. Rushing water, when a prophet needed to grasp the scale of what he was witnessing. And a voice thinner than silence, when a single terrified man needed to know he hadn't been abandoned. Here's where this stops being ancient history and starts being about you. You still carry that same instinct, even if you've never opened Exodus or 1 Kings. You still expect the important moments in your life to announce themselves loudly. A sign, a dramatic turning point, a voice or something like one, undeniable enough that you couldn't possibly miss it. And when life doesn't hand you that, when the crisis passes and no thunder ever came, you quietly conclude that nothing spoke to you at all. But ask anyone who has actually gone through something like Elijah's cave, grief, burnout, the kind of exhaustion where you're not sure you want to keep going, and they rarely describe a voice like a storm. They describe something closer to a thought that wasn't quite their own, a sentence that surfaced out of nowhere at exactly the right moment, a stillness that arrived, uninvited, right when the noise finally stopped. Thin, quiet, almost missable. Maybe that's the real inheritance ancient humans left you, buried inside a story about a mountain and a cave. Not the idea that God is loud, the idea that the loudest thing in the room is rarely where he chooses to meet you. You've probably wondered, at least once, what it would sound like if God spoke to you right now. Maybe he already has. You just weren't listening for something that quiet.